Something anyone has tricked you into believing.
I mean, I was raised to believe in a lot of very strange things, like really properly strange New Age beliefs. So it's hard to pick one. Um, I don't know. I mean, but my mom was a professional astrologer, so I've done.
I love that.
Oh yeah, so like too many to name, too many weird things to name that I don't know. I no longer believe in. But it's like being raised in being Hindu and then deciding that you are no longer believe all these things. It's the same kind of things, it's just a different set of beliefs.
Welcome to the Smooth Brain Society podcast. Have you ever come across something and thought, I'm not smart enough for this? We think the fault lies with those who present information in ways which are hard to understand. In an attempt to change this, we'll be speaking to researchers, experts, and all-round wrinkly-brained individuals, improving our understanding of a broad range of topics which are rooted in psychology. Join us as we try to develop ourselves one brain fold at a time.
Please note that the Smooth Brain Society podcast is distinct from the Herenga Waka Victoria University of Wellington. The views expressed on this show are those of our guests, presenters, and affiliates alone, and we assume no liability for the application of the information discussed. We also take no responsibility for any change in brain folds on part of the audience. Viewer discretion is advised. Now on to the podcast. Welcome back to the Smooth Brain Society, everybody. Happy New Year. Same me, Sahir here, but brand new guests, brand new co-hosts as well. And looking forward to getting into this season or this year's of podcasting, and bringing you more things to sharpen your brain with. On our very first podcast is being co-hosted by another PhD student in the School of Psychology here, Feryl Badiani. If she wants to introduce herself real quick.
Hi, I'm a PhD student at Vic, and I'm currently studying basically why Hinduism continues to thrive and survive as a major polytheistic religion when other polytheistic religions have kind of fallen out of favor. So that's my research.
Ooh. And with us today, our guest is Dr. Aiyana Willard, who also happens to be Feryl's supervisor. Dr. Willard is a lecturer in cultural and evolutionary psychology at the Brunel University in London. Her research interests focus on the origins and consequences of religion and other supernatural beliefs. She has also conducted heaps of research in Fiji, where she worked with Hindu, Muslim, and Christian populations, exploring bonds and divisions between religious and ethnic identities. So I guess from that little introduction, you can guess that our first episode is going to be on religions and religious beliefs. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Willard.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I guess we can start off with a couple of things. So a bit of a loaded question. How did you get into studying religions or studying your field of work? And then at the same time, how would you actually do that? So could you give us a few like definitions of like what you mean when you look at religion and religious beliefs and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I got into this. So when I did an undergraduate degree, I did a minor in religious studies. So I was doing psychology and religious studies, just from a long-term fascination. So I happened to be doing that degree at University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And there was a research lab that was doing psychology of religion. So I joined that lab, and I worked for them as a lab manager for a year before starting my PhD. So it was more just kind of been a general interest, long-term interest for me in terms of the topic of religion. It's fascinating. And it came largely out of traveling when I was younger. So I left my high school degree and went, and I actually spent several months in India and other parts of the world. And that was sort of, it's a very obvious when you go to any of those places how important religion is in the lives of people. So when you look at psychology, it's a really under discussed topic, right? So we don't really think a lot about within psychology about how religion affects people. And I think this comes out of the places that are where psychology is popular. So North America, Europe, places like Australia, New Zealand, where religion doesn't necessarily seem as central as it is in most of the rest of the world. But if you look around the world, vast majority of people are religious, and it impacts all sorts of areas of their lives, including their psychology. So that was sort of the origins of why I wanted to study this. Religion is not an easy topic to study because it's just a very vague and undefinable term. So when you talk about like operational definitions of your topic, there isn't one for religion. It's this very, we all kind of know what religion is. We can sort of categorize things as religion, but it's very difficult to come up with a concrete definition that doesn't exclude or include religions that are things that are clearly religious, or include things that are not, like political beliefs, those sorts of things. And there's a lot of things where we kind of get like, is this religion? It's sort of in the middle. So we get around this largely by looking at the bits and pieces of religion, in terms of like, we'll look at like ritual behavior, or we'll look at specific beliefs in a specific type of deity within a culture and how that affects people's broader perspective on psychology and their culture, those sorts of things. Does that answer?
That's a really cool story. And also interesting that you said that religion is not easily definable. So then someone as a researcher, what do you mean by like looking at like some bits and deities? Could you give us like an example of what you mean by that?
Yeah. So I mean, I've done. So, when the work that you talked about in Fiji, which is something I did in my PhD. So I've no longer work in Fiji. I haven't for years, but we were looking at diaspora populations, and how sort of they cooperate across groups. So Fiji, much like where I've been working more recently, Mauritius has lots of different religious and ethnic groups all kind of living together. So we can look at how people within a religious context, how religion shapes their kind of group identity and who they're associating with. So in Fiji, we were looking at one of the things we looked at was whether or not Indian origin populations who had converted to Christianity identified more and were more willing to cooperate with other Christians who were of a different ethnic group, or with Hindus who were kind of their origin group. And we found that the identity, people were much more willing to cooperate with the Christians. They saw themselves as Christian predominantly, rather than as part of this other broader. So they were more likely to cooperate with someone who shared the same religion than someone who shared the same ethnicity with them, because they had changed their kind of self-identity to be Christian, and then they were part of this sort of multi-ethnic group, rather than part of a single ethnicity. So we can look at things like how religion shapes that sort of identity. We do a lot of stuff. A lot of the research I've done has looked at how children learn religion, or how people have learned religion in childhood through attending rituals. So we'll look at specifically at the rate at which people kind of went to church, or their parents, they're aware of their parents doing things like giving tithing to the church, or canceling their holidays because of church, like making some sort of sacrifice in their lives to go to church. So we did this work in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, trying to compare these two countries that have very similar histories but really different religious profiles, to figure out what kind of led one country to remain highly religious and one country to become much less religious. So the Czech Republic is one of the least religious countries in the world, but Slovakia is quite religious. And it's largely based on this, right? So at some point you have kind of a different emphasis on whether or not you should attend or participate in religion for complex historical reasons I don't need to get into right now. But this creates a long-term change over a couple generations, where people in the Czech Republic just stop seeing religion as an important part of their lives because they're not being socialized into it. So in that case, we would sort of define a set of practices. This is, we call this credibility enhancing displays. So people who are doing a behavior or exposing people to a behavior that makes their beliefs credible, right? So, if you're in a family and your parents go to church every Sunday without fail, they do all of these other practices. They're participating in church charities. They're going to church events. They're kind of highly engaged with the church. You're going to grow up as a child thinking, oh, this is a really important part of my culture and belief and identity, right? If you live in a family who your parents may be equally strong in their belief in like a deity, but don't necessarily see the practices as important. So maybe you go to church, but like, if you have, football practice or something, you would skip it. Or if they're, going on vacation, you would skip church. Like you get that signal that maybe this isn't very important. So those people are much less likely to maintain their religious belief throughout their lifetime. And so you can get these large scale population level differences depending on how important people perceive that behavior and how kind of true they see those beliefs based on the behaviors they were exposed to when they were younger.
So, Aiyana, I just wanted to ask you about like creds, which you spoke about a bit earlier, which is the credibility enhancing displays, which is the costly displays that one engages in, like, or a child is exposed to. And you say it's like really crucial, or it's an important part of developing religiosity later in life, being exposed to creds early on. What about people who weren't exposed to creds when they were growing up and hence grew up non-religious, but then came to believe religion, like came to become religious later on? And a second question to that is, why are we religious at all? Like, why has religion been selected for over multiple years and generations?
Okay, so the movement from non-religion to religion, so the research on this suggests that most people convert back to religion or convert to a religion because of social ties, right? So they know someone, they have some sort of friend group. It tends to be transmitted socially. That's the predominant area of research. There isn't a lot of research on other reasons. So there's some suggestion that it would be things like having a hard time coping with life events, those sorts of things. So when traumatic things happen, people can sometimes convert. It's not clear that that's necessarily going to help them in the long run. I think it's quite difficult for people to change those belief systems. But those are some of the reasons. But largely, and by and large, the largest reason people convert is for they've met someone, they have friends, they have some sort of social tie. So even if you're kind of in a state where you're feeling like you need something more in your life, or there's some sort of crisis that you're having a hard time dealing with, the reason that you would become Muslim rather than something else, or rather than joining a dance troupe or doing something else, is because you have some set of social ties that has convinced you that this is important. So it's, at that point, it would still be socially transmitted, socially learned behavior. In terms of why, so most of my research, broadly speaking, for my entire career, has looked at this question of why we as a species are religious. So, religion exists in every human culture. Even if large portions of the culture aren't religious, we can't really identify any place where there isn't religion or isn't something that is religious, right? So it seems to be, in that sense, a cultural universal. So every place develops something we would consider religious completely independently, even if some people in that group don't necessarily adhere to those beliefs. And so there's lots of different reasons for this. And you kind of start with basically just how we process information. So we tend to see things as sort of purposeful and agentic in the world, and a lot of our kind of basic, assumptions about the world can lead to things that look somewhat supernatural, right? So humans are very superstitious. we tend to see patterns in things. We tend to associate things with sort of social causes rather than physical causes. So if something terrible happens to you, your house burns down on a New Year's Eve and everything is terrible, finding out that was because you had faulty wiring isn't a very compelling answer. You want to know, like, why did this happen to me? Why now? Those sorts of processes seem to be quite broad and quite universal, and that can lead to basic level superstition. So when you get from sort of an individual having these sort of intuitions that things are happening for a reason to large scale religions, is again going to be through social learning. So people share these beliefs, they are more or less compelling, and it's probably the case, although this is still kind of ongoing research, that when these beliefs get tied to ritual behavior is when they start really becoming religion. So we don't really see a lot of religious beliefs that don't have strong ritual behavior, and ritual behavior, as was mentioned before, is a really compelling way for other people to learn something is important, because they tend to be sort of rigorous, costly behaviors that people engage in to support their beliefs, right? So that is a really good way to teach people, or to kind of show to people that this is an important belief, this is something I truly believe in, and that increases the rate which it transmits. So, to get from sort of individual superstitions to these large scale shared belief systems, that's going to be processes of social learning. So, things like conformity fall in here, prestige bias learning, those sorts of things will also shape how a religion is spread to a whole group.
Sorry, just a sec. So when you mean costly, you mean it's like the actual effort put into the religion, or when you said like
Yeah, so I mean kind of in lots of different ways. So mostly it's effort, but also resources, right? So people put in, as well as time, people spend a lot of money, they bring food, they, depending on where you go, you get everything from like sacrificing goats to putting huge amounts of money into these rituals, paying a large amount of money. So those, in that sense, it's also costly, between time commitments and resources, and people generally across beliefs or across popular beliefs, they spend important resources, even if they're not time, to their religion. So they're donating food, they're donating things that are important to them, that are kind of central to their culture, to these things. So they're costly in multiple ways.
I'm guessing that includes like wars for religious purposes and things like that as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess that would fall into it. You have to build something fairly cohesive already to get to the point of war, right? You have to have some sort of strong, cohesive identity. And this doesn't, there's lots of things that do this. People fight for all sorts of reasons. But for a war to happen, for any group to, you have to convince a bunch of people that they are willing to die for other people in their group. And that requires a really strong cooperative social identity. So religions do this quite well, but there's lots of other systems that do it as well. But when we look at like the types of religions, we tend to, that kind of level of cooperation tends to be associated more with like these sort of morally broad moral gods, so gods that will punish you, or that have sort of strong beliefs about punishment for anyone who violates a rule, right? So you kind of have larger kind of overseer type gods who will punish all sorts of things, rather than sort of small gods that would punish. So in a lot of folk religions and smaller scale religions, you have like, if you don't wear a hat if you wear a hat in the village, you will get, something bad will happen to you, and they're very kind of smaller things. Illnesses and those sorts of things can be associated to violating basic social norms, and the deities are associated with that. But you can kind of build up from there to like gods that will punish any sort of broad, like if you are unkind to strangers or those sorts of things, and that's a very different system. But anything that kind of can build and associate your group as being something worth like dying for, and sort of usually above or kind of more human than another group, is very effective as at if you can think of what you're doing is better than what the other group is doing, it's much more effective at creating things like warfare.
Interesting. Would you know of particular reasons why certain religions, I guess, succeed while others haven't? Or if that's the right way to put it, or why certain religions have died off while others are still, well, expanding, I guess.
Perfect segue into the big gods theory.
Yeah, so a lot of work that I've done and others have done has been looking at this kind of theory of big gods, and this is largely specific to Abrahamic religions. As Feryl will know, there's not been a lot of work into things like Hinduism and other religions, Buddhism as well, into how they manage to spread and kind of maintain large group populations. I have a feeling that what's going on with Hinduism is quite a bit different, even than Buddhism or the other sort of Abrahamic religions. So when you look at the world today, there are tens of thousands of religions. People follow all sorts of beliefs, but vast majority of people are Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu. So the really big religions really kind of, that's, huge proportion of the world. So if you look at that group, then the only other group that falls into anything close to those numbers are non-religious people. So there's no other religion that comes even anywhere near any of those groups. And so so Christianity is the one that's been the most studied, although I think Buddhism would be the religion that first kind of starts doing this. So you have different sorts of beliefs that kind of go along with the religion. that allow it to spread to larger populations. So if you think about religions in most of human history, or a lot of folk religions today, they're tied to a specific group or ethnic identity. So you have sort of, this is our God, this is what we believe, you are one of us if you are born into this lineage, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, that's going to maintain a small group. You can't really expand beyond that. So when you one of the first innovations you get with these sorts of religions is that anyone can join the religion, right? So it's not tied to your specific, kinship lineage or anything like that. The people can join. So Christianity is a classic missionizing religion. Anyone can become Christian. You just have to convert. You can get lots and lots and lots of people coming in, right? So you basically expand that group identity from this very narrow ethnic group to kind of a broad, multi-ethnic, larger group. It can kind of expand indefinitely. So that's one innovation. And then the other one is what Feryl was referring to as sort of the big gods concept, right? So when we think about religions and how they relate to behavior and morality and sort of norm enforcement, we can look across religions, and one of the things they do very well is set out rules for how you should behave. So this is true of small-scale religions. So there's some really great work by a colleague of mine, Ben Brzezicki, looking at herders and so pastoralists in the Tuva Republic. And, you have these spirit masters, and they're looking after resources like the creeks or this land, and what they're concerned with is how people are sharing these resources, right? So if you're a pastoralist and you're sharing land, if anyone exploits the land too much, kind of everyone suffers. But how do you enforce those rules, or what kind of helps enforce those rules? And having a deity who cares about how much you graze on this land, or whether or not you pollute the stream, is very helpful. So you get a lot of religions like that throughout the world. But when you get sort of these larger, what we call world religions that spread, one of the things they start doing is expanding the moral domain as well. So you have these gods that are omniscient. They know everything. There's no way to escape punishment. You can't trick them. You can't, there's no, if you don't get punished in this life, there's a punishment in the afterlife. So there's no way to escape the punishment for your bad behavior. So any norm you violate, any moral rule you violate will be punished within, if not immediately and not apparently, within your next life. So that's a very compelling way to make people behave in a certain way. And then you get rules associated with them that are about things like anonymous strangers, non-groups of people you don't know, people who aren't part of your immediate community, probably still part of your religious group, but like Christianity has really broad rules about how you should treat everyone, right? Like whether or not you know them. That's a very interesting innovation, right? So you have gods that know everything, that will punish bad behavior, and have specific rules about how you would cooperate with people that you would otherwise, in sort of any sort of smaller scale society, really not have any kind of norms around, right? Like you treat strangers as strangers. They're not part of your in-group. You kind of just push them out. So you kind of broaden the moral domain to allow larger and larger groups of people to be part of it and to be part of these cooperative groups. A lot of these religions sort of evolved and sort of developed in big cities. So, Buddhism comes out of India when there is quite a high population density, and it starts allowing people to be, everyone can be part of the religion, whereas the kind of Hinduism at the time was very, very restrictive, even more so than it is now, in terms of who could practice and be part of religion. And Christianity sort of developed and really expanded within Roman cities. So groups where there are lots of people living in tight quarters, where cooperating across groups, where behaving in certain ways that kind of allow people to kind of function better as a large multi-ethnic group, really, really helps people. Right, so people would see the Christians and they would be doing better because they're looking after the sick. They're giving money to each other. They're kind of helping each other out in a way that a lot of other groups weren't. So then more people joined, because that, like, people within that group are just, they're surviving plagues better because looking after the sick is really helpful. Their people are less likely to starve. They're doing things like converting. They're allowing women to have kind of a higher status in the church, which I know seems a little bit backwards when you look at the world today, but a lot of these religions would give power to groups that were otherwise marginalized. So women would join, and then their children would be Christian, and those sorts of things. So that there's lots of different ways that this happens, but the big one is sort of expanding that moral domain and the kind of what is a group identity.
Sorry, Feryl, did you have something to say?
No, but like another interesting study I think done by Ben Berzicki himself was also like the perimeter of like basically the area in which an individual can exist. And if you exist in the area, then your God will care about what you do. And this you find in like some like folk religions. Like if you are in the area of which falls within the God's purview, then they care about it. But then if you're somewhere else or in another country and you're like, oh, if you break that rule, do you think your God will care? And they'll just be like, no. So it's also like in
Yeah,
some
like, if your God lives on this mountain and he can see everything that happens on the mountain, he can't necessarily see you from a different mountain. Right? Whereas Christianity or all of these other religions, they have a much more universal, like, so they're omniscient. God is omniscient. God always knows, and God will always punish you. There's no way to get out of this. You can't just be somewhere else. You can't, it changes the domain in which people, those moral rules are enforced by religion. So they're
Ooh.
no longer kind of specific ecological
To
niches.
that area kind of thing.
Yeah.
Oh, so is that one of the reasons why Roman or Greek like gods and stuff kind of faded away or are there other reasons for it in the sense like
I
all
mean,
of them lived in Mount Olympus as far as Greek mythology goes and so on and so forth.
I mean, these are complicated stories, and I'm not a classicist, so I don't want to wade in that area too much. But I think, from our perspective, it would just be that Christianity and these other religions just outcompeted them, right? So it's hard to, if you're a polytheistic religion and you have all of these rules, they kind of, the world in which they were adapted to, in which they were very functional, had changed. So you have larger and larger populations living together in these larger groups, and you're kind of, that functional set isn't necessarily doing the same thing as Christianity. But there are like political, there is also just chances of history, right? So some, Constantine decides to be Christian, that really changes a lot of things. You can have these other bits and pieces that really are clearly very important.
Yeah, like for example, and this also like creeps onto my research a little bit, but like why is it that these other polytheistic religions fell out of favor? And one can always argue that it's because the gods weren't good enough at enabling cooperation in larger and larger societies. But then the other argument is also who colonized the space. And then that's why Hinduism becomes a really interesting case, because India was colonized by the British. And of course, there's another political argument that the goal was never to spread Christianity, but we were under the influence. So why is that polytheistic religion still alive? So which is to say that the big gods theory, I guess, I mean, maybe let me just pose this as a question. What are some of the flaws with the big gods theory or the current dominant theories and that explain religion and religious belief right now, in your opinion?
So, I mean, I think the biggest and most obvious flaw is that it was largely based on Abrahamic religions. So this is a theory that works really well for Abrahamic religions, that was based in these types of religions, and sort of it's sort of laid claim to religion broadly, but it is specifically about a certain type of belief, right? And a certain type of, so I think in the tendency of our psychological science, we kind of lump religion as this large category, and everything within it can be explained by the same theory, but these are really complicated systems, and that isn't the case. So I think we don't have enough information about Hinduism yet. And I would say the same is probably true of Buddhism, although I think Buddhism might function slightly more closely to the Abrahamic religions in how it works, sort of in its broad, at least in its broad moral edicts, very different religious system. But we don't have good explanations for things like Hinduism, because it just hasn't been studied in the same way. So that would be the major flaw, is that we underestimate. I don't necessarily think that people, so the big architects of this are Aaron Zion is kind of the major architect of it, and then you have other people like Joe Henrich, myself, and a lot of other people who contributed to this, including Ben Berzicki. And I don't think any of us would sort of claim that this explains everything and this is the entire domain of religion, but it often gets portrayed in that way, that these theories will explain all religions, as opposed to the kind of fairly narrow set of religions that we exclusively studied, which is Christianity, and to a lesser degree Islam, right? These are Abrahamic, they have a similar historical root. They're Abrahamic religions, and they have a certain set of beliefs. So I think if we want to kind of expand that domain, we need to start studying other religious groups, and that is happening now, but it's less true. So one of the interesting things within both Buddhism and Hinduism, but in very different ways, is karma as a moral system, right? It isn't necessarily the case that you have gods that care and punish people. You have this other system that works in a different way. And so Buddhism has a much more universalistic view of karma than you would get in Hinduism. So those are interesting things to look at in an interesting way. So it's possible that karma in Buddhism might be working in a somewhat similar way to big gods within Christianity, Islam, those religions. But we don't, we have very little information on this. There's only really a handful of studies that might suggest that. Whereas I think within Hinduism, we can safely say that it's not clear that it's the same, and much more research needs to go into that.
Could you just expand on that? So, what do you mean by different views of karma? What's a universal view of karma?
I think so. Hinduism is, and I, Feryl is really the person to talk about this more than me. Hinduism is a kind of, it's much more like a collection of religions than a single religion. So you have this overarching label, which was brought in by the British to sort of explain what was probably a lot of very different but related religions, and they function for different groups in different ways, and so you're going to have quite a bit more variety of belief in terms of the things that people should and shouldn't do, what's punished, what gods care about. All of those things are going to vary quite a bit. When you look at Buddhism, there is variation. Buddhism, there are lots of different groups of Buddhism, but this kind of central, there are kind of central premises and things that people believe across these different groups, and one of them is sort of the kind of how karma works and how karma punishes is fairly broad and much more consistent than potentially is in Hinduism, or even like the awareness of karma, right? So it's not actually clear that all Hindus would think about karma. Or so when we ask people in Fiji, the Indian Hindu populations in Fiji, about karma, a lot of them it's not the thing they think about. They know it exists. It's not something that they would care about every day. Whereas if you look at work on Buddhist populations in places like Burma or other places where people I know have done research, it's something that's central to their everyday life. They talk about merit and demerit in every action, right? So what is this doing for my am I gaining merit, or am I getting demerits for this in terms of sort of my moral progress? So that's much more central within Buddhism than in Hinduism. I think Hinduism is a really interesting religion to study, partly because there's so much variation and we know so little about it. It often gets lumped in as just an afterthought when people talk about these world religions, and I think largely it's just because it's very complicated and very nuanced.
More of a thing of, it looks so complicated, let's not touch it kind of scenario.
Well, I think it's more of I think people underestimate the complexity of it. So there definitely is a tendency within the psychology of religion and the cognitive science of religion to just not really think about that variation, right? So when you study religion, you're studying all religions, even though your sample are vaguely Protestant Christians in the US. So you kind of think, well, this applies to religion. In the same way when we look at samples, if people have done research on Americans, it's unlikely that they're going to say that at any place in their paper that this was an American sample. It's not going to be in the title. It's not going to be in the abstract. It may not be mentioned in the paper. They're just people. Whereas if you do study anywhere else, you kind of have to say, this sample came from this place in this population, and this is a bit about this population. So, within psychology, Americans, and to a lesser degree, Europeans and people from Australia, various other places, become kind of default humans. We think of Protestant Christianity, and a specific type of Protestant Christianity that you get in the West, as sort of default religion, and it's very much not that, right? It doesn't even necessarily generalize to Catholics, or so.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask. That was what my next question was gonna be. Because as you mentioned, Hinduism looks a bit like multiple small religions within one another. how do you explain, well, Abrahamic religions like diverging into Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and even within them, how do you explain like these sects forming, like Protestants, Catholics,
So,
Anglicans, so on and
I
so forth?
mean, these are largely historical arguments rather than psychological ones, like at least for, so, you have Judaism, you start there, you have Christianity, of Islam that comes up. There's a good, history of this. We have a strong historical sort of story behind this in terms of, so that for me, the much more interesting question, I think, is the second one, which is, when you look at Christianity, how come there are so many different Christian groups? And I mean, the splits are usually over doctrine, or to a lesser degree, charismatic people. Right? So you get people who want to believe different things, and you get this in every religion, and they kind of split into two different groups. So the idea, the question is whether or not people kind of see themselves as still part of the same broad category or not. And this differs quite a bit across groups, and it differs within groups. So, Mormons would say that they are Christian. A lot of Christians would say that Mormons are not Christian, or they're not the same type of Christian as we are. And that's quite a, that just kind of falls into concepts of identity and who is part of your in-group and out-group, fairly standard psychological processes. But most of these religions will split because someone has, the Protestant Reformation is the best example of this. You were upset with the Catholic Church for things like indulgences, for these sorts of excesses of the church, and not following what people think is like a true religious belief. And so you have Protestantism splits off from Catholicism and then just proliferates into lots of different little religions for similar reasons, where people kind of break because of doctrine.
What is your opinion on, I mean, this is how I understood big religions splitting into smaller sects, is that every group starts having their own niche needs, and eventually the larger religion just can't match up to it, and so then it breaks and it kind of evolves to match the needs of the given community. A classic example would be Henry VIII wanted a divorce, could not get a divorce, changed the system, evolved the system, forced an evolution in the system so that it allowed for a divorce. And I guess that's the Anglican Church now. So what do you think cultural evolution has to do with more and more sects coming into being?
So, I mean, I think that that's part of the story, and that is true in some cases and not others. I mean, some of it is just, the spread of like charismatic churches right now. I mean, you could say that is a functional need, but it's not clear. It's just the fact that people like, the high pageantry is just much more compelling. A lot of Protestant religions can be quite like, this is going to get me in trouble. They're very boring. Like, they're not, you go to church. It's just not that interesting, right? It's quite a boring set of beliefs in terms of what you do. Whereas when you go to like, Southern Baptist churches in the US and a lot of the other charismatics, there's singing, there's dancing, people speak in tongues, there's all sorts of like intense pageantry, and the emotional impact of that is quite high. There's a really great book by a sociologist named Rodney Stark called The Churching of America. And this is despite the kind of current mythology of the US, it was founded as a fairly secular country. It wasn't a very religious country at its founding, and it became very religious sort of as Baptists and Methodists revival churches started spreading. So you have people kind of spread out over a lot of land where you have farmers who probably don't see people that often, and they're just not that interested in sort of what's called mainline Protestant churches. So people aren't really that religious at all, but you start getting these sort of what are largely untrained Baptist and Methodist ministers. So they're not people who've necessarily gone to the same level of formal school as some of the more common Protestant denominations. And they're just charismatic, and they go out and have revival meetings, and people come because like there's just nothing else to do, right? So you get these sort of really charismatic groups, and people are coming together in these large communities and having these sort of high pageantry emotional experiences at these revival meetings where like there are lots of people around, and that kind of spreads this kind of fairly evangelical Christianity throughout the United States.
that point which you made it kind of reminds me of something which my dad said ages ago when I'd asked him why our family was Muslim, and he was like, "Oh, they marketed it better to us ages ago." Um, so it's that kind of idea, isn't it? Where like, yeah, you need to it
Yeah,
needs
you need
it,
to, it
yeah.
is. It's there's a political sense to it in which it's like winning hearts and minds. So people go to churches and that they find compelling that fit their needs. I mean, and a lot of these things, I think historically, uh, well, okay, we won't go historically. We'll say when you look at kind of how religion spread in places like Papua New Guinea, um, there's some nice compelling cases for, this group is just doing better than us, right? For some reason, and that thing can have nothing to do with religion. For some reason, they're planting the food they're planting is growing better, et cetera, et cetera. Let's adopt their beliefs, right? So they're just sort of wholeheartedly adopting belief systems because people associate these things with the gods, and it's really hard to differentiate that. You can't really say it might be the soil quality, but you don't know. So, you adopt all the practices, and that includes their religious practices. So religion's also spread that way, where people see someone who is, or some group that is succeeding in some way, and they want to be part of that. I mean, you get with some of the more, we'll call them parasitic groups within particularly in American Christianity, like the prosperity gospel really feeds on this, right? So this is groups of people who you have charismatic preachers who basically say, like, you can buy your way into heaven, just send us money, and people will spend huge amounts of money. And they're getting on, it's like, well, look at me, I have a private jet, like I'm doing so well, it's because I have really bought into this prosperity gospel. And no, it's because you keep sending him money. But those are very compelling, right? It's people who are that kind of level of success and prestige for a group or an individual who kind of claims that this is because of their belief system can be very compelling to people who want the same thing.
We've asked a lot about how religions are actually formed, but is there a conflict within studying religions itself? Does being religious impede you being able to study your religion, or how does it work?
So I am not religious, and I wasn't raised religious. I was raised in sort of fairly, we'll go with New Age hippies. So some of the stuff I'm doing more recently, which is looking at like witchcraft beliefs in the UK, and spirituality in the UK is a little bit closer to kind of how I was raised. And I don't see any conflict there. I do know people who are, one of my collaborators is an ordained priest in the Anglican Church and is very objective. It's person based rather than, I think, faith based. There's no real conflict in believing and studying religion or any other kind of related area. So I think you're not going to find the people who are conflicted for other reasons, right? So you can be an atheist and have strong conflicts in studying religion, or you can be religious and have strong conflicts in studying religion. It's a matter of whether or not you can separate what you're doing objectively from your belief system. So just as an anecdotal point, when we get, what you do when you study religion, you get some nutty emails and letters and stuff sent to you by various people, and the atheists are much more willing to send just like, why are you studying this? It's unimportant. We already know what's happening here. Religious people are just less intelligent than others, or something like that, right? Those are the people that. So I would, based on the solely on the nutty emails, I would suggest that potentially strong atheism would be more of a problem than being strongly religious. But I think it's completely individual.
And I'm guessing that individuality goes the other way in the like people you're studying as well, those who are more willing to take part in whatever research you're doing.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things with our current projects looking at sort of witchcraft communities or Wicca communities and spiritualist communities in the UK is you really have to go back to some of the more anthropological methods compared to what we do when we study Protestant Christians, because there's enough Protestant Christians who will just answer surveys. They may not necessarily be, you may be missing this group of people. You're definitely missing the like very kind of hardcore religious people who are not interested in answering your surveys and are quite skeptical of it. but it's, you have to, within sort of some of these other communities that may have higher levels of skepticism, things like academia, although not necessarily true. A lot of them have been very, very open to working with us. You do have to kind of go in and state your intents and say, like, this is what I'm doing. I need some community buy-in here. We need kind of you need to be part of this research in a way that makes people feel comfortable with what we're doing, because we have no desire to alienate people or insult their beliefs or anything like that. So I think when you get into different sort of more diverse communities, that's a really, really key part, is making sure that they're involved, and the things that you're writing and publishing aren't in any way things that they would be unhappy with.
To kind of answer your question about whether religion and studying religion are conflicted, my personal anecdotal journey is that I started studying like CSR, like religion, when I was like low-key, I was like, yeah, I'm a Hindu, I fully identified with it, and now I'm like, no, I don't really want to identify with it anymore. So it led to like a transition of like, and now I'm like, oh, maybe I'm like culturally Hindu and not cognitively Hindu. It's like a constant journey where you're like trying to understand what my relationship with religion is, and like not believing in like the omniscient God part of it, but still liking the ritual part of it. But that is one. But I had another thought when Aiyana was speaking, was about Hugh's project on fuzzy fidelity. And if you want to tell us a little bit about that and how people may say they are religious but may not be.
Yeah, so I had his book somewhere. So I'll grab it right here. So a person I've worked with quite a bit. So he studies, so this is his Unholy Catholic Ireland. So he studies the decline of religion in Ireland. He's an Irish scholar, really, really great scholar within our field, really great researcher within our field. But one of the things that he has looked at is people who are, so Ireland is very, like, Catholicism is very closely tied to their kind of ethnic group identity. But there's a lot of things that have gone on. There's a lot of church scandals that have led people to leave the church. And so you get these people who are sort of culturally Catholic, but don't really want to associate with the church. They think the church itself is bad, but they still kind of want to maintain that Catholic identity, as well as people who are full-on atheists. And a lot of this is like based on sort of their own experiences, again, with ritual. And so people who were raised quite in very religious sort of high, sort of with like high credibility enhancing displays. So people whose parents were really involved in the religion and really they spent a lot of time sort of putting time and money and effort into that are much more likely to kind of maintain that Catholic identity, even when they've decided to leave the church, right? When they say this church is not good, they're doing terrible things, they've had real problems in our society, I don't want to associate with this anymore, but I'm not willing to give up my belief in God or kind of the vague sense of being Catholic, culturally Catholic, whereas people who haven't had that are much more likely to just full on become atheists. Just be like, so if their family wasn't, necessarily participating as much within the church, they're much more likely to grow up to be atheists. So this is interesting because it's in a situation where people are leaving the church en masse, but for a reason, right? So that's because of these scandals. You have sort of lots of people leaving, but you can kind of differentiate between who kind of maintains some level of belief and who doesn't, based on how much they kind of were involved in the religion and how much they were socialized into that religion as children.
Oh, Feryl, you had just mentioned when you said that you were culturally but cognitively not, right? Was that the terms which you used?
Yes.
So I'm guessing that the cognitively side means that those who like truly
I don't
believe in
really
religion.
believe in God. I don't really believe in the institution that Hinduism represents. I don't believe that God can punish me. But I don't want to let go of, I don't know, I'm a Gujarati, so I don't want to let go of like Navratri, which is like our key festival where we dance. And I'm like, I don't want to let go of that because I'm now an atheist.
Okay. All right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think you get this in a lot of, I think this is something that's often missed in the research on religion that's done within North America, because this identity side of it is overlooked, right? So the only place you see it within North America is people who study Judaism, where people are like they're they're culturally Jewish, they're ethnically Jewish, and they have they might still participate in the Jewish festivals, but they are completely atheists, and that's really common within Judaism in the US, but it's sort of seen as a phenomenon of Judaism rather than as something that might be quite more widespread for religions that have a strong social identity component to them, right?
Okay. The next thing which I need to ask is then what are the advantages of religions? Because we've spoken a lot about how they're maintained, how different forms of maintenance within them, different styles of religion as well. So what are the benefits of it? Like why do people have these beliefs? And yeah, and why, if people are leaving a religion, how do they still maintain benefits?
So
sorry, can I just ask an additional question? I don't know if it's related. So Sahar, can you edit this out if this is an irrelevant question? But Aiyana, does Sahir's question in any way also link to your work on medicine, folk medicine, and benefits of religion and folk medicine? Is that connected? Edit this question out.
Totally, but I'll answer the first one and then we can talk about the folk medicine stuff. Okay, so largely, and I think there is probably a lot more going on here than we are currently aware of because there hasn't been a ton of research on this. So one of the major, there's a lot of research on things like mental health benefits and health and just general health benefits that are I think largely specific to the US. So you don't see these sorts of things in the same way between religious and non-religious people in places like Scandinavia, where religion isn't the norm. So it may be something specific to religious belief. It may be something specific to being part of the kind of largest identity group within your population. It's a little bit unclear. So I think there's a lot more work to be done here. The stuff that we've worked on with kind of the big God theory and religion and morality is largely would say that, right? So one of the benefits of these is kind of forming cooperative groups where you can kind of police people in a way that isn't necessarily possible outside of religion. So, and that I don't mean that in a negative sense, but I think that there's, we live in societies, we live in groups, there are rules that we need to follow to kind of make that work. And a lot of them are cooperative rules and norms, just simply things like, don't, just because this person is a stranger doesn't mean you can steal all their stuff. Just because they're not a member of your family, we have very broad social norms about cooperation. And I think our societies now are much, much, much more cooperative than they have been historically. And this is simply because we're much more willing to interact with people we don't know. So for most of human history, you wouldn't necessarily come across strangers that often. So all of the norms are about how you associate within the community of people you are very familiar with, whose reputations you understand, whose names you all know, who you kind of know something about all of these people. And now we live in societies where most of the people you interact with in a day are people you've never seen before, will never see again. And that's a really different set of reality. So I think religion has really helped in scaffolding sort of the rules and norms and mores that sort of have gotten us there. So have gotten us to kind of associate with these larger and larger groups. And I think they function as well in kind of smaller communities in a similar way. They kind of set out rules and sort of motivations to follow those rules and belief systems that kind of motivate people to follow those rules within any community. So there is, this is great for, I think it's largely good. It's also the sorts of things that allow people to sort of build large armies and take over other groups. So when we talk about cooperation, we do mean in a largely neutral way, like just how you work with your community and your in-group. But I think that's kind of the largest benefits of religion from my research. Where you see this sort of disappearing is that a lot of the roles that these religions have taken, specifically within Christian origin countries, again, because those are the ones we know the most about because they're the most studied. A lot of these things have been taken over by secular institutions, right? So you have healthcare systems and welfare systems and all of these other things that protect us in ways that religion may and religious community may have really helped in the past, right? So, as well as kind of normative benefits, some of those normative benefits are things like shared childcare. Again, I mentioned this before about taking care of the sick, these sorts of things, the ideas of kind of charity and community that are often quite central to these large religions and sort of looking after people within your community, those roles are been replaced by institutions. We have police forces, we have hospitals, we have healthcare, we have all of these things that diminish a lot of the kind of really strong motivating roles of religion. So when you look at places like Scandinavia, where religion is no longer the majority, a lot of those things, they tend to have really strong secular institutions, so like very strong social safety networks, those sorts of things, and that can diminish the importance of religion and the role that religion played for a lot of people in their lives. So it sort of just becomes, you get a process where people believe, but because they don't necessarily need a lot of the resources that are coming with their church, they're maybe less willing to go. They're less willing to make sort of these large, what we're talking about, credibility enhancing displays, these large sacrifices for the church. They're spending less time there just because the resources that they're trying to extract are just less, and it seems less important to them. And then their children are less religious because of that, right? So you get this sort of slow decline where people aren't sort of aggressively rejecting religion. It's just fading from importance within a culture, which is something that happens quite a bit in Europe and has happened in a lot of other sort of technologically developed solid social safety net countries. So as places like the US, you don't see the same trend, and there have been some suggestions that might be due to the general lack of social safety nets within the US, that people still do need religion to kind of follow, to provide a lot of kind of basic needs that we have. So you have the opportunity for you to become destitute and lost with no community and nothing in some countries is higher, and it's higher in the US than it is, say, in the UK or in Sweden.
That's super cool. Because you mentioned like countries with like higher social security kind of nets or standards are like sort of replacing some of the things which religious institutes used to be involved in. So does that mean the opposite, that the poorest countries generally show like highest religious uptake?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily about wealth or poverty as much as like social welfare, but yes, you tend to see this correlation between countries that have lower social safety nets and religion. I think it's important to mention here that these are really complex systems with lots of moving parts, right? So it is not like a one-to-one correlation, but the tendency is definitely there, and there's some really interesting research, again, largely coming out of sociology, looking at these sorts of tendencies around the world. And there's a really, there's kind of a classic book that was written based on the World Values Survey that has suggested this, and it's I think the kind of follow-up work that's been done more recently that uses a bit more sophisticated statistical methods has done a much better job of demonstrating that there does seem to be a link here between the countries that have strong secular institutions and lower religiosity.
What is it called? The secularity hypothesis? Not the book.
So the secularization hypotheses tend to be, there's a broad set of them, right? So that would be one. The book would be Sacred and Secular by Norris and Engelhardt, but it's a pretty old book now, and I think there's some better stuff being done by people like Ingrid Storm and David Voss, who have kind of looked at similar things but with better statistical methods. So I mean, one of the things about the Norris and Engelhardt book, because even though I think they're probably right, you can't actually tell that from the statistics they use, because they're correlating factors across at a country level. So they're just, finding the averages for countries and making a correlation. And these are not independent data points. It's like very complex. There's lots of reasons, so if you find this correlation, it could just be that Scandinavian countries have a similar cultural heritage, and that's different from like Southern Europe, where you see these differences. So you have to kind of start ruling out those possibilities with a bit more sophisticated. As a general rule, you shouldn't trust anything that is just correlating country level averages in those countries, because it's too complicated a system. You don't know really what's going on there.
Yeah, that's fair. Can I then ask, what about things which people say are religions but are not really religions? I know you're researching things like witchcraft, wasn't it? Which you just mentioned?
Yeah, so I do stuff on witchcraft and wicca. So like witchcraft, we've been studying witchcraft beliefs in Mauritius, as well as we're starting to now. So we haven't actually done this research project. It's just beginning to look more at Wicca beliefs and these sorts of different alternative spiritual beliefs within the UK. But alternative spirituality is like probably my current biggest fascination in terms of research fascination.
Come to New Zealand. What do you?
I mean, everywhere. It's everywhere. It's not, if you come when you come to the UK and visit us, we will take you to the town that we are basing our research in, and you will be like, oh wow, this is a lot. Like this is everywhere. It's ubiquitous. It's the whole town.
I can't wait. I can't wait. But my follow-up question is, what do you think about the Maori belief system? Because
I don't really know much about the Maori belief system, so I don't know if I have much to comment on that. I'm part of a large granting group called Explaining Atheism Project, and so we actually have a researcher, Sarah Ramani, who's studying Maori atheism and the decline of religion within Maori population. So I'm very excited about this project because I don't know anything about it. So if you really wanted to talk to someone who knows a bit about that, I would recommend Sarah Ramani.
Ooh, maybe hit them up after this. But then we can focus on your work. So what are your current projects?
So I have a couple of current projects that are sort of either in the middle or that we're just starting up. And so one of them is looking at folk medicine. So this was a study we actually did with a archival data set in Ireland. So we coded a bunch of folk cures for all sorts of things, and we looked at sort of the diseases that they're associated with. So we were trying to test whether or not, we have all of these sort of ideas about why people are inclined towards supernatural-like beliefs, and we wanted to look at this in folk medicine. So essentially what we did is we pulled a bunch of theories out of the literature, so things that are more severe, things that are more uncertain, things that cause anxiety. All of these things should be more likely to induce supernatural-like beliefs or ritual-like behavior. And we found this data set so my collaborator on this, Michal de Barra, has found this data set that is just folk cures from 1930s Ireland. So they were collected by school children from their grandparents, and things like, if you want to cure a wart, take a snail, find a snail when you're not looking, stick it on a rose thorn, and when it shrivels, your wart will disappear. So those sorts of things. And, there's all sorts of very strange and wacky stuff in here. It's quite a cool data set. So we have everything from like creating ointments and drinking tea to these things where you're like getting holy water and on a Good Friday and doing something with it, or stealing meat from your neighbor and burying it in the ground to cure various rashes and that kind of thing. So we had all of the data. We had a postdoctoral researcher and some research assistants code all of this data, looking at just whether or not it had sort of these supernatural contents to it. So things that kind of couldn't be physically causal. So we couldn't understand as physically causal. So if you put an ointment on your skin, even if it doesn't work, there's a kind of physical causal process that we can understand. If you're drinking or ingesting things, there's a physical causal process that you can understand. But if you are stealing meat and burying it, or taking a snail and sticking it on a sticking it on a rose thorn and watching it shrivel, there's no real contact or physical process. So we're labeling those things as more supernatural. So essentially what we found is that diseases that had a larger kind of uncertainty component to them, so people don't really understand what causes them and they don't have necessarily clear symptomology, we're more likely to get these supernatural causes. So essentially, if you think about the space of possible explanations you can search, the more kind of uncertain things our theory is that people are just more likely to try more things, right? So you get these increasing levels of supernatural beliefs associated with things that kind of don't have there's no kind of obvious cause to them. People are just more willing to try lots of things, and you get these like larger number of supernatural cures associated with them. So that's quite a fun project. We've looked at this as well within Mauritius, and looked at things like reputational information. So people who have bad reputations, do people see their illnesses as more likely to be supernaturally caused? And so this is based on kind of the social theory. People want social explanations for misfortune, right? It's not that we're not that satisfied with these sort of broad physical explanations. We really want kind of like, why is this happening to me? Why now? And the only real information that can fulfill that, because there is no physical explanation that can fulfill that without some very complex belief systems and things like astrology. So the default ends up being social causes, right? Social causes are always a good explanation. This person is mad at you. So people are more likely to assume sort of supernatural magical causes to things when they know someone potentially deserved punishment for something else or had upset someone in the past. So they can associate that social cause to it. So that's similarly for folk medicine. We do similar stuff with witchcraft beliefs, looking at reputational information and specific sort of motivations. So people who are envious of others, or people who have we've looked at both people who are envious of others and people who have potentially caused envy in other people. So envy is kind of notoriously in the anthropological literature associated with witchcraft beliefs. And there's sort of a complicated set of theories around why this might be, but we were just interested in actually demonstrating this empirically. So if someone has a motivation for, like, if they're envious of others and they do something that's a bit ambiguous, people are much more likely to think, oh, they're probably doing witchcraft in a country that believes in that. So like if someone, we gave people a short story about someone who was envious of another, like he had a business and he was envious of another business, and then he did this thing and people were like, oh yeah, that's definitely witchcraft. He's doing witchcraft, right? Much more so than if we'd given the same story without the prompt of envy, or if we'd given them the story with the prompt that he was just, he wanted to do better for himself. And similarly, we find that people who sort of are showy with their material possessions and then bad things happen to them, people were much more likely to assume that was because of witchcraft. So this is, the general theory here is that people, it's enforcing a different type of social norm, which is essentially not showing off what you have, not bragging, those sorts of things, which can be particularly in groups that have a history of sort of lower resources. So if someone has a lot, then that's automatically taken away from how much someone else can have, because there's kind of a zero-sum set of resources. So those sorts of norms can be really important in maintaining social cohesion, right? So you don't want people to kind of show off their benefits, because it kind of puts in the face of other people who have less and can create social problems. So these norms potentially can enforce some of those beliefs.
Question: How, to what degree are your findings about folk medicine connected to the research that was done about British-born Chinese people engaging with folk medicine and then actual medicine? I can't remember who wrote the paper, but I think if it was something that had an easy remedy, I think they would rely on like more folk medicine. But I think the minute it got super serious, they went to the doctor, something like that.
Yeah, so we did look at severity and we didn't find any. So we don't have anything within either of our data sets that really speaks to like how bad the disease is. That doesn't mean that, so within the archival data set, it's just difficult, right? There's not a lot. There's a lot of cures for warts. There's not a lot of cures for cancer, right? So in that sense, it might speak to that hypothesis directly, but we can't necessarily show it. Within the Mauritius data set, we didn't have an effect of severity at all, but that can just be how that doesn't tell us much. It just shows that the way we framed it maybe didn't work. There is a lot of work. Well, there's work suggesting this, and I think there's no reason to doubt it, that people will engage in lots of different things. So it's not necessarily clear to me when people kind of do religious things and medical things, or more kind of biologically based cures or scientifically based cures and supernaturally based cures. That's really common. I don't think there's any real contradiction there. There's a lot of discussion in the literature about like how people could use these two very different systems, but I think that people don't think of them that way, right? People just think of, I'm sick, I will take all of these things that might help. Like, I don't think that there's a clear distinction in how people think about these things is necessarily, the way we frame them are supernatural and natural, but that distinction is not necessarily psychologically clear in people's minds. We're just doing it because we need to categorize things because we're scientists, and that's part of how we do it.
Right.
So I think people will take a spectrum of all sorts of things, and generally, even when you see, there's not a lot of people who won't accept my cat that won't accept biological sort of or medical cures. That's not that. People tend to go both ways. They do use alternative or folk medicine as well as sort of allopathic or evidence-based medicine.
Yeah, that makes sense. My grandma does that quite a bit. She'd like go to the doctor and do all that, and also take all other types of Ayurvedic to Unani to any medicine she can get a hand on. So yeah. Now to the idea of like attributing it to superstitious things, does karma come into that in a sort of way? Because that sounds very karmatic if someone's behaving in a certain way and then they get punished for it.
So I think there's work. So a lot of my research is based in cultural evolution, and there is some work that's come out of this that was led by a man named Mancha Kudik and Joe Henrich, looking at sort of what we call norm psychology. So, we as a species, one of the things we do really well is culture. What we learn from other people, we follow other people, we live in groups where we share the same beliefs. And so that does require some evolved psychological architecture to facilitate that, right? You can't get there from nothing. You have to have some set of rules that you start with that help you learn from other people. And so one of these things is to kind of accept norms. And you see this like right from childhood. People, like small kids, are very rule oriented. They may not necessarily follow rules, but if you tell them like we should do this way, they will enforce that on other people, right? So we're very, very sensitive to kind of social norms and breaking social norms. So I think this can be related to sort of karmic beliefs, but also just in generally how we think of social punishment. So some of the work that one of the papers that we're just finishing up right now looks at this in terms of norm psychology. So people assume that norms will be enforced and that they will be punished, and it's not necessarily clear how people will punish norms, right? So they just, the assumption is there, probably as just part of this architecture, that things, if you violate social rules, you will be punished for them. Whether or not I do it, someone else will. And that can kind of very easily extend to people seeing supernatural agents as punishing. Or supernatural.
I can corroborate that with my data, which I'm offended that I did not cite. Just kidding. Like a lot of people in my data, when I was interviewing people, like, what is the role of karma? What makes someone a bad person? How do you know if a god is upset with you? They would just be like, oh, if I've fallen sick, then I know it's God. If I've done that, basically it's not God, but it's like karma. It's like my bad karma. I know God is upset with me because if I fall sick, or if my business meeting goes through, or if I'm in a car accident. So there is a connection to karma.
Yeah. But yeah, a lot of the stuff we're moving into is sort of these what are called like New Age spiritual belief systems in the UK and in other places, and this is a really interesting phenomenon because when you look at things like the secularization hypotheses around strong social institutions and social safety nets, people leaving religion for that, there's still this fairly large subset of people who will leave religion and then just find some other spiritual movement that maybe doesn't have the same institutional structure as religion. So they're leaving the institutions, but not necessarily the types of beliefs. And so that's quite interesting to look at. Like, what is it that draws people to these kind of more spiritual belief systems and these kind of other types of belief systems? So we can look at the needs that those are meeting, which are maybe not currently captured in some of the existing theories. And I think some of this is a different type of community. So they're not necessarily looking for these broad institutional support communities, but people are looking for sort of a smaller sense of community and a community of like-minded believers. And they're learning these beliefs from other people. They help them explain the world, they help them explain their lives, it makes them feel more comfortable. And they're also associated with this sort of smaller scale level of community. So that's kind of the project that we're about to start in the UK, is looking at like New Age spiritual communities and how people are kind of learning belief systems from each other and how they're being transmitted in those kind of smaller scale groups.
Are New Age spiritual beliefs similar to what is it called? New religions? Religion is.
Well, so new religious movements tend to have institutional structure, right? So they tend to usually have either some sort of charismatic leader who started them, but there is some sort of institution around it. That's how they kind of get defined as a religious group. It's not, a lot of New Age belief systems don't have that at all. So there, people come in and, you go, so have you ever been to like an occult bookstore or a New Age bookstore? You go in and there's like sections on like yoga and like vague versions of Hindu philosophy, and then there's Buddhism, and then there's Wicca, and then there's like, some other types of nature worship, and just like there's things on aliens, there's, crystal healing, and you kind of just go in and like, I want crystal healing and aliens and yoga, and that's my belief system. I want these three things, but there are these strong communities that support that. And in the UK, there's quite a lot of communities around like sort of magic beliefs, right? So beliefs that people can, that your mental states could influence the world in a certain way, and that you can control that through ritual and other sorts of behaviors. And there's quite a big community of that here. So that's also quite interesting in terms of how people think about spirituality and these beliefs. But it's a very new project, so I don't have a ton to say on it. Coming soon.
That's exciting. So we can bring you back on to talk to you more about that then.
Yeah, about our studies of Wicca communities and goddess worship communities in the UK.
Can I ask one question, which is kind of random, but have you heard the saying, and I guess because you're in the UK, you would have that football is a religion?
Yes.
So my question then becomes, where do things like this, which people say is a religion, but is not, like cult Harry Potter fans and things like that, where do they fall in terms of what separates them from actual religious beliefs, or like New Age religions, as you said, where you just pick and choose things?
So I think getting back to my original point that I started with, very hard to define the term religion, and it was a fuzzy category, right? So when people are talking about football as a religion, they're talking about the level of devotion people have to football, but they're excluding one of the things that we find interesting, the most interesting, which is like these sorts of larger supernatural beliefs and the sort of transcendental belief system that involves deities or some sort of larger worldview with things like afterlife or ghosts and a broader kind of transcendental belief structure. Football doesn't have that. Even when people have superstitions, what people are talking about is just a level of devotion and commitment that people are making to football or to Harry Potter. I mean, you could see something like Harry Potter becoming a religion if people start having ritual worship and it's associated with sort of sets of moral rules and behavioral norms and that sort of thing, that you kind of get this overarching belief system around it, then it would be a religion. But just being really devoted to those kind of that world and that the concepts within those books does not necessarily constitute a religion, at least in my view. I mean, I think, again, it's a fuzzy category. It's hard to define. But I think most people would say, really, you can talk about football as like a religion, but it's not really a religion.
That's cool. Thank you.
Leave it up to Sahir to ask sports-related questions. Just because he plays like every single sport on planet Earth.
I just really needed to it because I don't know. I guess the difference being, if you consider football a religion, all of a sudden you start praying to God, hoping your team wins, so then kind of breaks the...
Yeah, but I think even there, you're probably playing to a God that is associated with a different religion. Like, it's not, football itself does not have
that's what I meant. Yeah.
So, the people think of it in terms of like, if you're watching football enough that it could constitute like praying 5 times a day or going to church, those things, like that level of devotion can be quite high, but that's one piece of what we talk about when we talk about religions. It's not the whole.
That's awesome. Feryl, did you have any other questions to ask?
Firstly, your cat is purring so loudly. I could hear it.
Oh, I thought that, I keep asking people this because she's on my lap and she's very, very loud for such a tiny little creature. But most people tell me they can't hear it because I was assuming my computer was like editing out the rumbling noise, but
it's okay. I'm double recording this, and on one recording it pops up, on the other it doesn't, so we're fine.
Okay, cool.
either or.
Okay.
Okay.
She's moved over, so she's no longer purring on my lap.
I'll tell you what we can do in interest of time. We do a little set of rapid fire kind of questions, with
Okay.
all our guests. So these are like general things. We'll ask him and then yeah, answer as quickly as you can. All right. So I can start off. I'll ask the first one. So summer or winter?
Summer.
Cats or dogs?
Cats.
She has 2 cats. I knew this.
Yeah, one made an appearance as well. So, if your life was a movie, what genre would it be?
Science fiction.
Interesting. What animal would you like to be?
Human.
No, it's not an animal. That's such a boring.
It is an animal.
It
I
is an
disagree.
animal.
It is an animal.
It's you're the first person to give that answer. I respect it. Uh, what superpower would you like to have?
Torn between teleportation and the ability to not procrastinate.
Ooh.
Well, I'll take the second one.
Yeah, right? It would be a really
No,
great
no,
superpower.
no. Teleportation. I want to go back to India for free.
Yeah. It's a tough call. Because I think like how much more I could accomplish in my life if I didn't procrastinate. But potentially it wouldn't matter that it costs money to fly to India.
Is there any research between religious beliefs and procrastination?
There is a bunch of stuff on sort of motivation and self-control with religions that would lead to lack of procrastination. But again, these are things where it's not clear if people who tend to be that way are more likely to be religious in places where religion is an option, or if it's correlational.
Okay. What is your least favorite type of music?
Probably heavy metal.
I would say religious chants. That's pretty bad type of music.
What, dance? Like techno?
Religious chants.
Religious dance.
Chants.
I don't. There's some okay stuff there.
Christmas carols are all right. I quite enjoy them.
Christmas carols are not religious.
One of my favorite, this is not my favorite type of music, but one of my favorite, I do really like gospel music, like American gospel music is fabulous.
Really? Yeah, I don't know why I said religious chants. I actually like some of the Hindu prayers. But then there are some that have become like really bad. Like the Jain stuff I don't really like. And I can say that because my mom is Jain, so I'm not really being
some of it is boring.
So boring. Okay. If you could, sorry, no, it's Sarah's question.
If you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be?
New Zealand.
No. I mean, I would probably pick, West Coast of Canada. It's my home, so it's hard to, Vancouver Island area is beautiful, really amazing place. It's hard to not want to live there.
Even after you've been to Mauritius and Fiji?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to live in Fiji. Mauritius is quite tempting, but I think, it's not home. And I don't know if you've ever been to the west coast of Canada, but it's very nice there. It's a very pleasant place to live. It is beautiful. It's very culturally quite nice.
And it was amazing. Except everyone waited for the signals to turn green to walk. Nobody was jaywalking. I was surprised.
In Vancouver?
Yeah. I was like,
disagree.
I cannot.
As someone who lived there for almost a decade, I jaywalked a lot.
I guess it's not technically a crime to jaywalk there, is it? I'm pretty sure certain countries you get fined quite a bit.
It's not a crime in the UK to jaywalk. It is in fact a crime in Canada.
Oh, damn.
It's not enforced. It's not an enforced crime, much like most drug use and various other things are not enforced crimes, particularly in Vancouver.
That could be a sci-fi thing movie, Dr. Aiyana Willard Criminal, and then it's just you jaywalking.
They wouldn't give me a ticket unless I did something dangerous.
So a jaywalker. It's something anyone has tricked you into believing.
I mean, I was raised to believe in a lot of very strange things, like really properly strange New Age beliefs. So it's hard to pick one. I don't know. I mean,
yeah, give some childhood anecdotes.
Oh, God.
which you're okay with like putting on Spotify or something. Just saying. Just saying. Don't.
I mean, so like like my father has basically his hobby for my entire life has been preparing for the apocalypse. So there's been everything from Y2K to like the Mayan apocalypse, all of these things. So the kind of vague idea that the world might end in some sort of cool but spiritual way was something that I kind of grew up believing. So my dad had he had food stores and all of that kind of stuff. He was like a hobby prepper for whatever current potential end of the world was coming. Yeah. Aliens visit the Earth. That was a very common one. Tarot cards, astrology. Yeah, and like it was just sort of a common belief that there's. But my mom was a professional astrologer, so I've done all of the astrology.
Professional astrologer. I need to know
for a while. It wasn't her main job when I was. She managed a health food store. That was a health food store in Canada for most of my childhood. But yeah, she worked as a professional astrologer for a while.
You know what your star sign is?
I'm a Libra.
Do you know what like your moon is and your
Virgo? Wait, I can't remember. I might have a Sagittarius moon and Virgo rising. It's been a long time since I've thought about this, but yes, I've had my whole. I could get you my entire astrological chart if you really wanted it.
Wow,
I love that.
Well, yeah. So like too many weird things to name that I don't know. I no longer believe in. But it's like being raised in being Hindu and then deciding that you are no longer believe all these things. It's the same kind of things. It's just a different set of beliefs.
You might be the perfect person to ask then. Is there any science behind astrology? Like at one point or at any point of like how it devised, was there any basis to it?
Not in the sense that it would impact you. The stars don't impact your life. So, I mean, I think, there's a lot of math and astronomy behind it. So a lot of early astronomy is related to astrology research because those things weren't clearly differentiated. There might be something so when you look at, like, when you really dive into astrology, you get these sort of things like the influence of Pluto and for like generational influences. And they're definitely going to get like people from different generations are going to be different. It's not because of Pluto, but it's because the culture changes. So I think there's ways you can see these kind of associations being true or following some sort of pattern. You can say like, well, in the 60s, this was influencing, and that's why everyone was like this. I think it's a little bit harder when you get to individuals, and a lot of it becomes quite general. But yes, I'm not an astrology believer. Not currently an astrology believer.
Okay then. So if you were not doing this, what would you be doing?
World traveler? Is that a job? That was, I mean, when I was a teenager, that was my career of choice, was going to be a world traveler. I was going to go places and work for 6 months in places. And this is something people do this. This is something I realized when I was in India at 19. I was backpacking in India, that there are people who just travel their whole lives. So they just do menial jobs and go places and get money to travel on the cheap. And I thought that I could do that. That would be fun.
Arguably, academia is the same thing. Just
I mean, it's just better paid.
Better paid. You gotta go to conferences.
I get to do all sorts of stuff. I travel for work a lot, so I did follow that career, my career choice. But this is, people always say things. There's a lot of like, if you get a PhD, you could potentially do something else that has you could get paid better for and all that thing. And I think that may not have been true of me. I'm not sure I would have stuck with much. I think this is probably my best option in terms of careers based on my nomadic tendencies and personality type.
Both worlds. A good, well-paying job, traveling.
Yeah.
All I hear is wins. If people want to join academia, I'm not someone who recruits people into this field. It's not my job.
I always tell people to go traveling first. Go take a year off. Go something else. Figure out if you actually are interested in this.
Awesome. Whoa, that leads me to our final question. If you could leave us, the listeners, everyone, with one piece of advice, what would it be?
Are your listeners primarily psychologists or psychology interested researchers? Who
Well,
are your listeners?
that's a good question. We've gotten well, as far as like the stats go, the age group is mainly between 18 to 30. So I'm guessing wide range of young people. Quite a few would have been students at universities, but it's a mix.
I guess, I mean, my standard advice I give to my students, in our modern day, to do what you love, follow your dreams, all that stuff, is to remind them that regardless of what your dreams are, they will require paperwork. so, to be realistic about what you're getting into in terms of your career. I think if for people who do research, particularly in psychology, my soundbite of advice is talk to your participants. This is something that I think has been lost. Interact with people. If you want to know something about a group, do some qualitative interviews with them, interact with how, particularly in the realm of religion, you need to actually, if you want to understand what people believe and why they believe it, you can't just do online surveys. You need to interact with those people. You need to actually find out something about their lives, the broader circumstances in which their beliefs are held, if you really want any insight into what's going on there.
You can cut this out, but my favorite piece of one of my favorite pieces of Aiyana's advice. No, I don't know what the sentence is. My favorite advice that Aiyana has given me is that nobody's going to read your thesis but except for two people in one room. So don't worry, just write whatever.
There's another side to that, which is like the things that you publish as papers, that's what matters. So like, polish up your papers and just finish your thesis.
True. But I do like the idea that not more than two people are going to read my work. Takes the off.
Lots of people will read your actual published papers, trust me.
And this is the point where this turns into a supervisor-supervisee meeting between Aiyana and Feryl. So on that note, we can probably end the episode. One last thing before you go, Aiyana. If people wanted to contact you, how would they get in touch with you?
Email is the best way to contact me. My email address is my name, aiyana.willard@brunel.ac.uk. You can find it by Google. I'm a very Googleable person. I have a very unique name. I'm very easy to find on the internet. If you email me and I don't answer your email, you should email me again. I get a lot of email. I mean, give it some amount of time, like at least several days, but I do get a lot of email, so sometimes I miss stuff.
What about Twitter? What if I tweet at you?
You can tweet at me. I am on Twitter. I am increasingly less on Twitter as it slowly descends into the darkness. But yes, I am on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter. You can message me on Twitter or tweet at me and I will respond.
Awesome. Well, thanks guys so much. Thank you, Feryl.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, that was my cue. Thank you for having me.
Thank you both. It's been a lot of fun.
And thanks, Aiyana. And thanks everyone for listening. Well, until next time, remember that dreams have a lot of paperwork. And yeah, take care.